Josephine Hale did not cry when she heard him laugh. She sat on the far side of the library door, a ledger open across her knees, a pen still wet in her hand, and she listened to her husband's voice carry through 2 inches of oak, as though the wood itself agreed with him. "She's the only one still trying," the Duke of Ashbourne said, and his friends laughed with him, low and easy, the laugh of men who have never once been weighed and found wanting. God love her. She irons the linens herself. Have you seen it? A duchess ironing linens. They called her diligent, as though diligence were a kind of joke. They called her earnest, the way one calls a dog earnest. Lord Farrow, somewhere in the dark beyond the door, said something Josephine did not catch, and the room laughed again, and her husband did not defend her, because it had not occurred to him that she needed defending. It had not occurred to him that she was 12 feet away, with a pen in her hand and a column of numbers that did not balance. She did not slam the ledger shut. She did not weep into her sleeve. She set the pen down, blotted the last line she had written, and closed the book with the particular quiet of a woman who has decided, in the space of one breath, exactly how much of herself she intends to give a room that does not deserve it. Not humiliated, not broken. Only certain, now, of something she had suspected for 11 months, and had been too generous to say aloud. They had married her for the debt her father owed the House of Ashbourne, and the Duke had never once looked past the number. Outside, past the tall windows, autumn was coming into the Virginia hills the way it always did, without asking permission, turning the tobacco fields the colour of old coin. Ashbourne Hall stood on its rise the way it had stood for 60 years, indifferent to what happened inside it. Somewhere beyond the lawns a dog barked twice, and went quiet. The candles in the library guttered once, as candles do when a door somewhere else in the house opens and shuts. Josephine Hale, Josephine Fenwick now, though she had never once heard him say it as though he meant it, rose from the window seat, tucked the ledger under her arm, and walked toward the stairs without hurrying. She passed the library door. She did not look at it. A footman, young, new, still learning which silences in that house meant something, watched her go and said nothing, because he had already learned that much. At the top of the stairs, in the dark, a man she had spoken perhaps 40 words to in 11 months of marriage stood very still, one hand on the banister, watching her come up. Alexander Fenwick, 6th Duke of Ashbourne, had not been in the library. He had been standing exactly where he stood now for longer than she knew, and he had heard every word his friends said below, and something in his face had gone rigid in a way that had nothing to do with anger at her. He did not speak. Neither did she. She passed him on the stair the way water passes a stone, and something in him turned very slightly to watch her go. It was the autumn of 1798, in the hill country west of the James River, in a house built on rows and reckonings, though only one person in it yet understood how literally that was true. If a story like hers is the kind that stays with you, subscribe to the channel now, so you don't lose her in the current of everything else. She had not always been a duchess. 11 months earlier she had been Josephine Hale, 23 years old, keeping her father's accounts at a kitchen table because there was no one else left in the house to do it, and she had been good at it in the specific, unglamorous way that no one in her circle had ever thought to admire. Her father, Edmund Hale, was a gentleman farmer with a gentleman's talent for owing money, and a labourer's talent for none of the ways to earn it back. He had borrowed against his land from the Ashbourne estate 8 years before, a modest sum at the time, swollen since by interest her father had never quite managed to outrun. The old Duke had never pressed him for it. The old Duke had a soft habit of forgiving what he did not need. But the old Duke had died the winter Josephine turned 22, and so had his eldest son Edward, thrown from a horse on a frozen road not 4 months later, leaving the title to a second son who had never wanted it, and a ledger of debts he had never chosen. Alexander Fenwick had been a captain of dragoons when his brother died. He came home to a house full of strangers calling him Your Grace, and a stack of papers that told him, in cold clerkly hand, that half the county owed the Ashbourne estate money it could not pay. Edmund Hale's debt was the largest of the small ones. The marriage had been proposed not by Alexander, who scarcely knew the Hale name, but by his father's old solicitor. As a tidy solution to an untidy problem, the debt forgiven, the Hale land folded quietly into Ashbourne's own, and a daughter, unmarried and past the age most families worried about, settled respectably in the bargain. Alexander had agreed to it the way he agreed to most things that year, without argument, without particular feeling. He was not cold, he was grieving, and grief, worn long enough, looks exactly like cold from the outside. There is a difference, though almost no one in that house had cared enough to look for it. Josephine had agreed to it because her father wept when he asked her to, and because she loved him, and because she understood arithmetic well enough to know there was no other sum that balanced. She had not expected warmth. She had expected, at best, to be tolerated, and at worst, to be a line item herself. The wife who came with a debt attached, filed and settled, never quite forgiven for needing forgiving in the first place. She had been right about the second part far more often than the first. What neither Alexander nor his friends downstairs understood, what only Josephine and the audience of her own life could see, was that the debt they thought they had absorbed had never been as large as the ledgers claimed. Edmund Hale had borrowed $1,100, once, 8 years before. The papers Alexander's solicitor had shown him at the wedding listed the debt, with accrued interest, at just under 4,000. Josephine had done the arithmetic herself, twice, on the back of a laundry list, the week before her wedding, and the number would not come out to match. She had said nothing. She had assumed then that grief and haste had let some clerk's error stand uncorrected, and that it was not her place, as a bride nobody wanted for herself, to point it out. She no longer assumed that. She had been keeping her own private ledger for 4 months now, copied by her own hand from the household books she had quietly taken charge of, and the numbers in it disagreed, in small and patient ways, with the numbers in the estate's official accounts. Someone in that house had been rounding in his own favour for a very long time. She did not yet know who. She intended to find out. That was the wound beneath the wound, not merely that her husband had married a debt instead of a woman, but that the debt itself was a lie, and she was, as far as she knew, the only living person aware of it. The first months of the marriage had been furnished entirely with politeness. Alexander was never unkind to her. He simply did not see her, in the particular way a man does not see furniture he has always known was there. He inquired after her health at breakfast. He escorted her to church. He signed his name beside hers on documents that required 2 signatures, and thought no further about it. Josephine had not asked for more. She had, instead, asked Mrs. Tilbury, the housekeeper, for the household account books. Mrs. Tilbury was 61 years old, had run Ashbourne's kitchens and linens for 30 of them, and had watched 2 dukes come and go, without once losing the flat, assessing looks she gave every new face that crossed her threshold. She had given Josephine that look for the better part of a week before she handed over the books. "You want to keep these yourself, Mrs.?" Tilbury said. Not a question. "I do," Josephine said. "The last 2 duchesses never touched them. I'm not the last 2 duchesses. Mrs." Tilbury had studied her for a long moment, the way a woman studies a new tool to see if it is sharp enough to trust. Then she had set the books on the table and said, "Hold your head up in this house, Duchess. Nobody else is going to hold it for you." It was the first kind thing anyone in that house had said to her, and Josephine had carried it like a coin in her pocket ever since. The household books, once she had them, told her nothing was wrong with the linens or the larder. It was the estate books, kept separately by the steward, Mr. Silas Pruitt, that troubled her. Pruitt had managed Ashbourne's land and its tenants for 19 years, through 2 dukes, with a reputation for being difficult to question and impossible to replace. He handled rents, timber sales, and the accounts that fed the number the solicitor had used to price her father's debt. Josephine had asked, once, mildly, over supper, whether she might see the rent rolls, only to understand the household finances more fully. Pruitt had smiled at her the way a man smiles at a child who is asked to hold the reins. "That's rather beyond a lady's interest, Your Grace," he'd said. "I shouldn't want to trouble you with figures." "I like figures," Josephine said. All the same. He had not shown her the rolls. She had gotten them anyway, 3 weeks later, from a tenant farmer's wife who kept her own receipts out of habit and let Josephine copy the numbers into her private book while her husband was out in the field. Josephine had sat at that farm wife's kitchen table with a cup of chicory coffee going cold beside her, and felt, for the first time in 11 months, entirely herself. The numbers on the tenant's receipt and the numbers in Pruitt's official rolls did not match. Not by much. 8%, near enough, and always in the same direction. She wrote the figure down. She underlined it. And she said nothing to anyone, because she had learned, in a childhood spent watching her father lose everything, by trusting the wrong men too loudly and too soon, that a suspicion said aloud too early is a suspicion easily buried. That had been 3 weeks ago. Tonight, sitting on the stairs listening to her husband laugh at her through a closed door, she understood something else clearly for the first time. It was not merely that Alexander did not love her. It was that he had never once looked closely enough at anything in that house to notice what she had already found. She intended to make him look. The chance came 4 days later, in the small hours, in a room that smelled of dust and tallow candles and old paper. Josephine could not sleep. She had taken to walking the east wing at night when the house was still, carrying a single candle, because it was the only hour in which no one required anything of her. She came upon Alexander in the estate office at 2 in the morning, a lamp burned low, a stack of correspondence untouched at his elbow, and his head in his hands in a posture she recognised instantly. Because she had worn it herself, alone, more nights than she would admit. He heard her at the door and straightened at once, as though caught at something shameful. "Forgive me," he said. "I didn't think anyone. I couldn't sleep either." She did not retreat. She had spent 11 months retreating from that particular doorway, and she found, standing in it now, that she was tired of it. "May I come in?" He hesitated. Then he nodded, once, and gestured at the chair across from his desk, as though she were a tenant come to discuss a lease, which was, she thought, at least a kind of honesty. The desk between them was covered in ledgers. She recognised the hand in half of them as Pruitt's. She recognised, too, the particular exhaustion on her husband's face, not the exhaustion of a man overworked, but of a man drowning quietly in numbers he did not understand and was too proud or too grief-worn to admit he could not read. "You keep the household books yourself," he said. It was not quite a question. "Mrs. Tilbury told me." "I do." "Why?" "Because someone should, and I was already awake." She let a beat pass. "Your Grace, may I ask you something plain?" He looked at her properly then, for what she realized, with a small cold shock, might have been the first time since their wedding. Not at her face for its own sake. At her, entire, the way one looks at a person one has decided belatedly, might be worth looking at. "Ask it," he said. "Do you understand these books?" A long pause. His jaw worked once. "No," he said finally, and something in his shoulders eased at the admission, as though it had been sitting on them a long time. "My brother understood them. I was a soldier. I understand orders and terrain and the weight a horse can carry. I do not understand why the timber accounts from the North Wood have not balanced in 3 years, and Pruitt tells me it is a matter of weather and market. And I have no way of knowing whether that is true." Josephine reached into the pocket of her dressing gown and drew out the small worn notebook she had been keeping for 4 months, and set it on the desk between them without ceremony, the way one sets down a fact rather than an accusation. "It is not weather," she said. "I have been keeping my own figures since spring. Would you like to see them?" He looked at the notebook for a long moment before he reached for it, as a man reaches for something he suspects will change the shape of his evening. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked, turning a page. "My father's kitchen table. There was no one else to do it." She watched him read, watched the small furrow that appeared between his brows as the arithmetic assembled itself into a shape he did not like. "I am not showing you this to frighten you, Your Grace. I am showing you because you asked whether the timber accounts were honest, and I believe I can tell you that they are not." He looked up. For the first time in 11 months, something in his face was not politeness and was not grief. It was attention, entire and undivided, the particular stillness of a man recalculating what he thought he knew. "Show me," he said. It took the better part of an hour. She walked him through the figures the way she might have walked a green recruit through a drill, plainly, without flourish, letting the numbers do the arguing. The rent rolls that did not match the tenants' receipts. The timber sale entered at $11 a load, when the mill 3 counties over paid 14 for lumber half as good. The pattern, small and patient, repeating itself in Pruitt's hand across 4 years of books, always shaving a little. Never enough at once to be noticed by a man too busy grieving his brother to look closely. 8%, Alexander said at last, low, half to himself. Consistently, Josephine said. A man who steals unevenly gets caught. A man who steals the same small amount every time for years is betting that no one troubles to add it up twice. He set the notebook down very carefully, as though it might shatter, and looked at her the way one looks at a locked door that has just unexpectedly opened. "You've known this for weeks." "I have." "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I did not yet know whether you were a man who would believe a woman's arithmetic over his steward's word," Josephine said evenly. "And I did not care to find out by being dismissed. It was the closest she had come in 11 months to accusing him of anything. He did not flinch from it. He absorbed it the way a man absorbs a blow he has, somewhere underneath his pride, been expecting. "I would like to be that man," he said quietly. "I am not certain yet that I have earned the right to say so. It was not an apology. It was something more useful than one. The first plain, unguarded sentence he had spoken to her since the day they married. Josephine felt something in her chest loosen very slightly, the way a knot loosens before it is fully undone. "Then earn it," she said. "Read the books yourself, Your Grace. Every week I will show you how, if you'll let me." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. The ghost of the idea of one. There and gone in an instant. So brief she might have imagined it had she not been watching for exactly that. "I would like that," Alexander said. "I would like that very much." It was very late. Neither of them said anything further about the laughter through the library door, though both of them, in their separate silences, were thinking of it. The alliance that grew after that night was not built on declarations. It was built on Tuesday mornings, when Alexander began coming to the estate office an hour before the rest of the household woke, and Josephine met him there with coffee and her notebook, and no ceremony at all. It was built on the particular intimacy of two people bent over the same column of figures, shoulders nearly touching, saying nothing for long stretches except the low exchange of numbers. 61, she would say. That's 4 short of last quarter. It is. Look at the date. Pruitt signed the entry the same day he left for the county fair. You think he was careless because he thought no one would check. I think he has never once had to imagine someone checking. Alexander began to laugh less at his club, and more in that office, short surprised sounds he seemed almost embarrassed by, as though laughter were a language he was relearning. Twice, Josephine caught him watching her instead of the ledger, and both times he looked away first, and both times she pretended not to have noticed, because pretending, she found, was its own small kindness. She did not tell him everything. There were nights she went to the estate office and found notes in his hand about tenant complaints he had not yet mentioned to her. A secret worry about the Northwood tenants he seemed to be carrying alone. "You're keeping something from me," she said one evening, watching him fold a letter before she could read it. "I am," he admitted. "The Miller family. On the North Tract. Pruitt says their rent is 3 seasons unpaid. I don't yet know if that's true or if it's another 8%. Then tell me when you know." "I will," he said. "I only wanted certainty before I brought you a worry that might be nothing. I would rather share the worry and be wrong together than be spared it and be right alone," Josephine said. And he looked at her for a long moment, as though she had said something larger than she meant to. He did not press her, either. When the aunt's carriage arrived unannounced one October afternoon, and Josephine's spine went instantly straight, the way it did whenever anything threatened to touch the fragile new peace of that house. Lady Augusta Fenwick, the dowager's sister-in-law and self-appointed conscience of the family, arrived with opinions the way other women arrived with trunks, many, and unpacked immediately. "You've let your steward run tame," Augusta announced within an hour of arriving, apropos of nothing, over tea Josephine had poured herself because the second maid had taken ill. Edward would never have tolerated it. Edward understood how a house should be run. "Edward is dead," Alexander said, quietly, and something in the room went very still. Augusta had the grace to look, briefly, ashamed. It did not stop her from turning her attention to Josephine a moment later, the way a hawk that has lost one target simply finds another. "And you," Augusta said, surveying Josephine's plain wool dress with the particular thoroughness of a woman pricing a horse, "still ironing your own linens, I hear. One would think, given what this family paid to have you, you might at least learn to look the part." It was the same laugh from behind the library door, dressed now in daylight, and a matron's certainty of her own wit. Josephine felt Alexander go rigid beside her. She set her teacup down without a sound. Around Josephine something did not flinch, something that had spent 4 months copying figures at strangers' kitchen tables, and 11 months learning exactly how much of herself she owed a room like this one. "I'll say this once, Lady Augusta, and then we needn't discuss it again," Josephine said, and her voice did not rise. "I iron my own linens because I was raised to know the value of things done properly, whether or not anyone is watching. I keep this house's books because someone ought to, and I have found, in doing so, that 8% of every rent and timber sale in this county has gone somewhere it was never meant to go. I imagine that is a rather more useful use of a duchess's hours than she is generally given credit for." The room was silent. Augusta's teacup did not quite make it back to its saucer. "That's a very serious accusation," Augusta said, recovering. "It's an arithmetic fact," Josephine said. "I don't generally deal in accusations, Lady Augusta. Only sums. There is a difference, though it took the rest of the table a moment to understand it." Alexander set his own cup down. He had not spoken since Edward's name. When he did not look at his aunt. He looked at his wife, and something had settled into his face that had not been there an hour before. Not quite pride, not quite wonder, something plainer and steadier than either. "My wife is correct," he said, "about the figures, and about the linens." A pause. "I would ask you, Aunt, to remember that when you speak of her again in this house." Augusta did not apologize. Not that day, but she left 3 hours earlier than she had planned, and she did not, for the remainder of her visit, mention the linens again. That night, in the corridor outside her own chamber, Alexander stopped Josephine with a hand not quite touching her arm. "I should have said something sooner," he said. "In the library." That night. She knew then that he had known she'd heard, all along. "You should have," she agreed, plainly, because she had decided somewhere in the last month that plainness was the only currency worth spending on him. "I am sorry, I know." She studied him a moment. "Do you understand why it mattered? It was never the laughing itself, Your Grace. It was that you didn't think there was anything in me worth defending." "I know that now," he said. "I did not know it then." A pause, longer this time, as though he were weighing whether to say the next part at all. "I have not laughed at you since. I find I don't much want to laugh at anything, when you're the one being discussed." It was not a confession. It was close enough to one that Josephine felt the floor of the corridor shift very slightly beneath her. The way ground shifts before the walls above it show any sign of strain. She did not let it show. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." But she carried the sentence with her up the stairs and turned it over twice before she slept. The miller's trouble surfaced properly 2 weeks later, and it was worse than either of them had feared. Pruitt had drawn up a note claiming the Miller family owed 3 seasons back rent, some $40 in total, and had quietly begun proceedings to have their small parcel reassigned to a tenant more current in his payments. A cousin of Pruitt's own wife, as it happened, though Pruitt had not mentioned that connection to anyone. Josephine had gone to the Millers herself, on foot, in the grey hour before the frost lifted, and sat at their table the way she had sat at a dozen tenant tables that autumn, and asked to see whatever papers they kept. Sarah Miller, thin and proud and frightened in equal measure, had produced a cracked tin box with 3 years of receipts inside, every one of them marked paid in Pruitt's own hand. "He signed these himself," Josephine said, laying them out across the table like cards. every quarter. Paid in full. We told him that, Sarah Miller said. He said the books say different. Said maybe we misremembered. Called my husband a liar in front of the children. Josephine felt something cold and clarifying settle over her. The particular calm of a woman who has just found the last piece of a puzzle she has been assembling for months. You didn't misremember, she said. Mrs. Miller, I would like to keep these, if I may, and give you copies in exchange. I think your family is about to become rather important to a matter of some size. The Millers did not understand, not fully. But they trusted her enough by then to hand the tin box over. That evening Josephine laid the Miller receipts beside her own 4 months of copied figures and beside the estate's official rolls, and the shape of the whole thing arranged itself in front of her with the terrible clarity of a wound finally exposed to light. Pruitt had not merely skimmed. He had, over 19 years, built a second set of books beneath the first, inflating debts on tenants he wished gone, quietly redirecting the difference, and using the estate's confusion after 2 dukes' deaths to cover the seams. Her own father's debt, she now suspected, had been inflated the same way, the difference pocketed by a steward who had correctly calculated that a grieving new duke, flush with a brother's death and a war behind him, would not think to question a solicitor's tidy figures. She brought it all to Alexander that night, and watched his face change as he understood, piece by piece, that the debt his family had used to justify their marriage had very likely been a lie from the start. If this is true, he said slowly, your father never owed us what we told him he owed. I believe that's so. Then you married me for a debt that didn't exist. I married you, Josephine said, for a debt I believed existed because I had no reason yet to think otherwise. That is not the same as being owned by it. There's a difference, Your Grace, and I would ask you to remember it, whatever we find. He was quiet a long moment. What do you want to do? I want Pruitt exposed properly, in front of witnesses who can't be bought or embarrassed into silence. And I want it done with paper, not accusation, because paper is the only thing a man like that can't argue with. And your father's debt? When it's proven false, I want it forgiven in writing, in the county record, so no one can ever raise it against my family again. She met his eyes. I do not want you to simply forgive it yourself, out of guilt, tonight, over this desk. That would only replace one kind of owing with another. I want it undone the honest way, in the light, where everyone can see it was never real to begin with. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face was very close to admiration. You could have asked me to simply cancel the debt an hour ago, he said. I would have done it. I would have signed it away tonight and never thought twice. I know, Josephine said. That's why I didn't ask. The blow, when it came from Pruitt himself, and it came fast. He must have sensed the ground shifting beneath him. A duchess asking too many questions of tenants, a duke suddenly reading his own ledgers, an aunt's visit gone strangely quiet on a subject she usually enjoyed. Whatever warned him, he moved before Josephine was ready. 3 days after the conversation in the estate office, a letter arrived at Ashbourne Hall addressed to the county magistrate, with a copy delivered, as though out of politeness, to Alexander himself. It bore Pruitt's careful hand, and an entirely different story than the truth. It accused Josephine of falsifying the estate's rent records herself, of altering tenant receipts to manufacture a fraud that did not exist, in order, the letter suggested delicately, to discredit a loyal steward and seize greater control of an estate her marriage had only ever entitled her to by charity. It was accompanied by 3 ledger pages, expertly aged, bearing what appeared to be Josephine's own hand, recording payments that had never been made. Alexander read it standing in the front hall, still in his riding coat, and Josephine watched the colour leave his face. "He's accusing you," he said, disbelieving. "He's saying you forged the evidence." "Let me see it." She read it twice, her jaw tightening with each pass, and when she looked up her voice was steadier than her hands. "These pages are forged," she said. "Not by me, by him. Look at the ink, Your Grace. Mine has gone brown with age, everywhere in this house, because I mix it myself from a recipe my mother used. His forgery is still faintly blue. He copied my hand well enough to fool a stranger's eye, but he could not copy 4 months of oxidation in 3 days of panic. Can you prove that in front of a magistrate?" "I can prove considerably more than that," Josephine said. "I've kept copies of everything, Your Grace, from the very first week. Every figure I ever wrote into that notebook I copied twice, once for myself and once locked in Mrs. Tilbury's still room, because I have never in my life trusted a single copy of an important thing." Alexander exhaled, something between a laugh and a groan. "You knew this might happen. I hoped it wouldn't. I prepared as though it would." She folded the letter closed. "He has made one mistake, and it is a large one. He has forced this into daylight 3 weeks before I meant to. We are not ready. But neither is he as ready as he thinks. There was no time to be ready, in the end." Pruitt, sensing his own exposure, had gone further than the letter, had gone that same week to speak privately with the county magistrate, an old family friend of his late father's, and painted Josephine as an ambitious bride grasping for control of an estate that was never fully hers. It was. Josephine understood grimly, a story built to work precisely because it flattered every assumption a room full of comfortable men might already carry about a woman who kept her own books. A hearing was called for the following week, to be held not in a private room but in the county courthouse itself, before the circuit magistrate and whatever portion of the county cared to attend. Word spread fast in a place that small. By the time the date arrived, it was clear that most of the county intended to attend. The darkest question, the one Josephine did not say aloud to anyone, not even Alexander, was the one that kept her awake the night before the hearing. If a room full of men chose to believe a 19-year steward over a bride they had never fully accepted, no ledger in the world would save her. The courthouse in the county seat was not large, but it filled that morning the way a church fills for a funeral everyone secretly wants to attend. Josephine sat beside Alexander at a plain wooden table, her tin box of copied receipts stacked in front of her, her hands folded flat against its lid to keep them from trembling. The magistrate, Mr. Aldous Crane, was a narrow, exact man with ink permanently worked into the creases of his right hand, and he opened the proceedings with the flat patience of someone who had adjudicated a great many disputes between people who hated each other for reasons that predated the argument in front of him. Pruitt spoke first. He was good at it. 19 years of managing men who did not want to be managed had given him a voice built for reasonable-sounding lies, and he laid his case out with the steady, wounded dignity of a loyal servant forced to defend himself against an ambitious young wife who had never liked being told no. "I have served this family faithfully since before His Grace was born," Pruitt said. "I do not know why the Duchess has taken against me, unless it is that she resents being managed by anyone at all." But I have the pages here, in her own hand. He set the forged ledger sheets on the table with a flourish, recording payments that were never made. I do not say this with pleasure. I say it because it is true. The magistrate examined the pages without expression, then looked to Josephine. Your Grace, you may respond. Josephine rose. She did not raise her voice. She had learned, this last year, that a raised voice asks a room to believe you, and a steady one simply tells it what is so. Mr. Crane, she said, I would like you to compare the ink on those 3 pages to the ink in my own notebook, which I have kept every week since April, in front of witnesses who can attest to it. She set her notebook on the table beside the forged sheets. Mine has aged as ink does, brown uneven, the way iron gall ink turns with time and air. His forgery is blue still, because it was written days ago, not months. I invite the court to examine both under the window light. A murmur went through the room. Crane leaned forward, took both sets of pages to the window himself, and held them to the light for a long, silent moment. Something in his face changed. Continue, he said. I would also like the court to hear from Sarah and Thomas Miller, Josephine said, whose family Mr. Pruitt attempted to evict for rent he had himself marked paid, in his own hand, in receipts I have here. She opened the tin box. And I would like the court to compare the rent rolls Mr. Pruitt submitted to this estate over the last 4 years against the figures actually received by tenants across 6 farms, which I have copied and cross-checked myself, and which consistently show a shortfall of 8%, redirected, I believe, into accounts Mr. Pruitt controls privately, including one held in the name of his wife's cousin, who received the Miller tenancy Mr. Pruitt was attempting to seize. The room had gone very quiet. Pruitt's composure, so carefully built through his opening statement, had begun, almost imperceptibly, to crack at the edges. This is absurd, he said. A woman's arithmetic against 19 years of service. Then let the arithmetic speak, Josephine said. And we shall see whose 19 years it favours. It took the better part of 3 hours. Sarah Miller testified, her voice shaking but clear, holding up receipts marked in Pruitt's own hand. A clerk from the county recorder's office, summoned at Josephine's request the week before, confirmed that the timber sale figures Pruitt had submitted did not match the buyer's own recorded purchases. Obtained, at Josephine's suggestion, by a rider sent 3 counties over. And Crane himself, examining page after page of Josephine's careful, cross-referenced notebook against Pruitt's official rolls, found the same 8%, over and over, in a pattern too consistent to be accident, and too small, individually, to have ever been noticed by anyone who was not looking for it on purpose. By the time the sun had moved fully across the courthouse windows, Pruitt's careful dignity had given way to something more desperate. He rose once, mid-testimony, and pointed at Josephine. She has wanted my position since the day she arrived, he said, his voice rising for the first time. She has never trusted a man in her life to do a job she thought she could do better, Mr. Pruitt, Crane said, not unkindly, but with the flat finality of a man who has heard enough. The Duchess has not asked this court to trust her over you. She has asked it to trust arithmetic, which does not care who performs it. I find that it does not favour you. Pruitt did not shout. He seemed, in the end, to deflate rather than break, the air going out of 19 years of careful position, all at once. He sat down heavily, and something in his face, for just a moment, looked less like a villain than like a tired man who had told himself for so long that he deserved what he had taken, that he had almost believed it. Crane's judgment was not cruel. Pruitt would forfeit his position and repay what could be traced, though the court acknowledged plainly that some of it, laundered through years and accounts now hard to follow, might never be recovered in full. He would not hang, nor be imprisoned for long, given his age and the county's mercy for a man who had, whatever his crimes, once served honestly before he did not. He was given a choice rarely extended so gently: leave the county quietly, or face a harsher accounting of every year, not merely the ones Josephine could prove. He left within the fortnight, and no one in the county heard from him again. And Edmund Hale's debt, examined at last in the clear light of Josephine's own patient documentation, was found to have been inflated from its true value of $1,100 to nearly 4 times that sum. The difference vanished into the same accounts as everything else. Crane struck the false portion from the county record himself, in his own ink-stained hand, while Josephine sat very still and did not cry, though it was, perhaps, the one moment that entire year when she might have been forgiven for it. "Your father owed this family $1,100, Crane said, looking at her over his spectacles. "Which I understand His Grace has already forgiven out." "He has offered to," Josephine said. "I intend to repay it myself, over time, from the household savings I have managed this year. I would rather it be settled than forgiven, Mr. Crane. There's a difference, and I find I prefer to be the one who closes the account." Alexander, beside her, said nothing, but she felt him looking at her, and when she glanced over, the corner of his mouth had moved into something that was, for the first time in a year, unmistakably and entirely a smile. They walked out of the courthouse into a cold, bright afternoon, the county still murmuring behind them, and Alexander did not let go of her hand once they reached the carriage steps. "You could have let Crane strike the debt and said nothing more about repaying it," he said. "No one would have thought less of you." "I would have thought less of myself," Josephine said. "I did not marry into a name to be carried by it, Your Grace. I would like, for once in my life, to be the one doing the carrying." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his voice, when he spoke again, had gone unguarded in a way she had never heard from him. "I have been trying to find the right way to say something for 3 weeks, Alexander said, "and I find I have run out of clever approaches to it. So I will simply say it plainly, since you've taught me that's generally the better way." "Say it, then. I did not marry you for anything, Josephine. Her name, not her title, the first time. In over a year he had used it, not for a debt, real or false. I have come, this year, to love you for exactly what you are, which is the most honest and least easily frightened person I have ever known. I should have seen it the day I married you. I am only grateful I was not too great a fool to see it eventually." Josephine did not weep, though something in her chest had gone entirely, finally. "Undone. That's the first true thing you've ever said to me in front of witnesses," she said, glancing at the small crowd still lingering near the courthouse steps. "Then, let them witness the rest of it too." He took her hand properly, turned it over, pressed his mouth briefly to her knuckles, chaste and certain. "I love you. I should like the whole county to know it, since the whole county has spent a year watching us pretend otherwise." "I love you as well," Josephine said, and found the words came far more easily than she had ever imagined they would, once there was finally nothing false left standing between them to say them around. "Though I would remind you, Your Grace, that I loved the version of you willing to read a ledger long before I loved anything you said about it." "Noted," Alexander said, and for the first time since she had known him, he laughed the kind of laugh that had nothing performed in it at all, startled and full, and entirely hers to hear. The years that followed were not without their ordinary troubles, but the ledger, once corrected, stayed corrected, and the county learned, slowly and then all at once, that the Duchess of Ashbourne kept better books than any steward the family had employed in 3 generations. Josephine did not stop at the estate's own accounts. Within 2 years she had opened a small school in the old dower cottage, teaching tenant daughters, and, before long, a handful of sons as well, to read a rent roll, keep a fair ledger, and know the difference between an honest figure and a convenient one. She called it simply the Ashbourne School of Accounts, and Sarah Miller's eldest daughter was among its first graduates, going on to keep the books for 3 farms of her own before she was 20. Lady Augusta Fenwick, to everyone's quiet astonishment, became one of the school's most consistent patrons. She never precisely apologised for the linens remark that was not in her nature, but she arrived one spring afternoon with a trunk of fabric for the schoolroom curtains, and stayed to watch a lesson, and something in her manner toward Josephine afterward had softened into a rough, unspoken respect that both women understood better left undiscussed. Alexander read every ledger the estate produced for the rest of his life, every week, without exception, a habit he credited, whenever anyone asked, entirely to his wife. The tenants of Ashbourne came to know a version of the almost smile that had once been so rare it was remarked upon. It appeared often now, easily, whenever his wife walked into a room he was in, and no one in the county thought it worth commenting on any more, because it had simply become the ordinary weather of that house. 10 years on, standing at the door of the schoolroom on a bright autumn morning, much like the one on which her story had begun, Josephine watched a dozen tenant children bent over their own small ledgers, adding columns with the same fierce concentration she remembered from her father's kitchen table, and she found she did not think of herself, any longer, as the girl who had come to that house carrying a debt. She thought of herself as the woman the county now called, without irony, the Duchess who could catch a false number from across a room. She had never asked to be seen. She had simply made herself impossible, in the end, to overlook. That was the whole of it. And it was enough. And it was everything. If Josephine's ledger, and the year it took her husband to finally read it right, stayed with you the way it stayed with me, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, what was the moment you knew he finally saw her? Was it the estate office at 2 a.m, or the courthouse steps, or somewhere quieter than both? I'd love to know, and I'd love to know what city you're reading this from tonight, because I want to see just how far her story travels. There's another one waiting for you next, whenever you're ready for it.